Yeah, yeah. I've seen the term. And to me, that's just code for society, basically.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Global Village. If you don't mind, maybe we can get started a little early. So as you know, with these LLC events, we actually usually start these about 15 minutes ago. The reason we started this a little late is I teach a 3:30 to 4:50 class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but I let them out 20 minutes early, and then I discovered there was no reason to start the event late. So, because they didn't read. None of you are in that class. Read. Make sure you do the reading. I'm just going to say that right now. So, without further ado, thank you for coming to Global Village's first talk of the winter semester or spring semester, whatever you want to call it. We don't really have winter here. We just have, slightly colder nights. But welcome to Global Village. I got to do the little plug, the little line I wrote myself, this is where America meets the world and the world meets America. And we're dealing with love and culture. And I gave it a very broad title, so that way our esteemed participants can take this in any direction they want. But with us today, and I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Jack Schultz, anthropologist, and then for the first time ever, Mr. Paul Hartley, husband of Dr. Kristen Koenig, and depending on my children, Jennifer Kargas also maybe talk. We'll see. If they freak out, no, but if they're cool. So to go with what we're going to deal with here, we're going to have Dr. Schultz do some opening remarks about kind of as an anthropologist talking about this subject, and then we'll probably fit in Jen to talk about a little bit of her experience, one particularly scary experience in Kazakhstan, and then we'll have our very own intercultural couple talk about their experiences. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Schultz.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good evening. Welcome back. Anything you'd like to talk about today? Anything left over from last time? Questions, comments? Hey, good evening. Love, was that what I heard? Cross-cultural? Love and culture? Interestingly, the word love is not found in every language. And it's not that they don't have a word that we translate as love. They don't have the concept of love like we know. How it is that we divide things up. So I can say something like this: I love my wife. We've been married now almost 43 years to each other. And I love her. But we can also say I love ice cream. This is an interesting word, but it's not found everywhere. A lot of other cultures will divide it in ways that don't make sense to us. In some ways contradictory, even to the way that we would speak about it. Love is a complex emotion. So I guess right here from the very beginning, we'd have to recognize that whatever is being considered is pretty darn broad. And there's lots of things that could be said, and only a few of those things would be said tonight. Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today. Love. Ooh, love.
Did you practice that, Dr. Schultz?
I say it pretty much every day. Even that. Okay, so let's say the word marriage, and we think that must mean something, right? And we could say this. It's actually observationally accurate to say that every culture on the planet recognizes marriage. And that's fair. Something changed.
Plan on just hosting
Okay, I needed to be boosted up. So my wife and I have been married, as I said, almost 43 years, but that pales in comparison to her aunt and uncle who just celebrated their 61st wedding anniversary. That's pretty amazing, right? However, my wife's aunt and uncle, they don't sleep in the same bed, not even the same bedroom. And they have different entrances to the house. They can go for weeks without seeing each other. So when I talk about marriage, this thing that I have with my wife, and I think about marriage, what my wife's aunts and uncle have with each other, they really mean something different. But we're using that same term, and that gives us the idea there must be some kind of equivalency. Yeah, in a little tiny area, perhaps. And then you start throwing in something like polygamous marriages or same-sex marriages. Suddenly it gets very complicated very quickly. What do they have in common? Are we actually talking about the same thing or something different? And this institution that we would call marriage functions so differently in different contexts. I would even say that marriage in my parents' eyes is a lot different than the thing that I call a marriage that I have with my wife. And I would guess that if we went around the room here where people are experiencing marriages, we'd have a lot of different ideas as to what it is. Very subjective, but that is the nature of relationships, isn't it? And that each one of these relationships has these unique opportunities to develop and express some of those unique characteristics that we have as human beings. Lots of different ways of doing this thing, both called life and marriage. If we look at the demographic data, it turns out that most Americans marry people like themselves. Like themselves socioeconomically. Okay, so in about the same rough amount of income that you have or wealth that's available. And we marry within that group. Rarely do you have somebody who's extremely poor marrying somebody who's extremely wealthy. Yes, it does happen. We call that the Cinderella story, but it doesn't happen frequently. Most of us will marry somebody within that same socioeconomic category. Also, in terms of our language, of course. Most of us are going to marry somebody in the same language. Linguistically, it is critical that we communicate with each other. And if a person doesn't know your language, chances are you're not going to fall in love with them and spend a lifetime together. Yes, I have seen Love Actually. I do know it happens, but it's very infrequently. Education level. In fact, many of you will even find spouses at Concordia. You will tend to marry somebody of the same educational level that you have or you aspire to. Ethnicity, another one of those factors. Most of us will marry within our ethnic or racial group. Most of us will. And lastly, we will marry somebody in the same religion as us or non-religion, if you want to put it in that category. That is true for most of us. We will marry within those categories, so we perpetuate these categories. The demographics are changing a bit. There are more Americans who are marrying outside those groups, but it's still like a 1% difference, somewhere around 5–6%. That's significant. You think of all the people you could fall in love with and get married with and be happy? Well, you know, 90% of the world's not going to fit in that category that you have available. Somebody in China speaking Mandarin, not speaking English, what are the odds of you marrying them? Of course, very, very low. The reality is most of us are going to fall in love with somebody that shares these things in common with us. And what that marriage looks like, that relationship is going to be radically different. I ran across a study recently completed. One of the benefits from marrying outside of any of these categories, you marry somebody who is different in terms of wealth or ethnicity or language. Okay, actually I can back this up. It's not even marriage, but if you date somebody who is outside of your demographic categories, you will develop more creativity. And I think that's intuitive also. You marry outside of these categories, you're introduced to a bigger world. You have new options available to you. There's other ways of thinking about things. Now, dating will do that. That's a long-term relationship or an intimate relationship, even if it lasts only a few weeks or a few months. But there's an intimacy that's there that you don't get just by talking to somebody from another culture tradition. I married a white woman. She fit in the same categories as me, and she fits the same demographic criteria that I told you: linguistically, economically, educationally, religiously, ethnically. But there was still a tremendous amount of adjustment that had to be made learning how to live with her. And it was less living with her, more living with her family. That was like another culture, another set of ideas about the right way to live. And there was continual disagreement about that. I think as Americans, we're very naive in imagining that marriage is a man and a woman. It's actually a family and a family, like it or not. You are marrying into a family, and that matters. And if you start producing kids, this family suddenly gets bigger and more complicated, and now you've got these other ends that have to be tied. And that's where tremendous adjustment is required. I'm mindful when I was working among the Lakota people, the Sioux, a Native American group of the Northern Plains, I learned of their tradition, their historical tradition for dating. Imagine this. So these were people who lived in teepees. They were mobile homes, and they were made out of hides and canvas. The way that a date would take place is a young woman would sit outside of the teepee, leaning against the teepee on the outside. She'd cover herself with a blanket, and then she would invite men to come in and talk to her. They would actually be lined up if she was very popular. And for those that she was interested in, they'd get to stand under the blanket face to face, whispering to each other because anybody could hear. And they would talk for minutes or even hours, and then she would let him go, and then the next one in line would come. And if she didn't care so much about that one, it would only be a few moments. Imagine if that was the way that you got to know somebody, and this is what was expected. For us, we've got this thing called dating, in which you get to experience a person in these different contexts and say, is this a keeper or not? Is this somebody I'm willing to spend my life with or not? And that is the decision we make. And we say, yeah, this is somebody that I'm willing to agree to get in the long-term with. But you know, that's not universal either. There are plenty of communities that arrange marriages. It's not left up to the couple themselves. The way that they'll speak about it, this is way too much of an important decision for you to make. It has to be made for you. So you would have that generation above making the decision, and they would recognize your personality and the personality of the person that they're wanting to connect you to. Say, we think this is a good match, and it's good for the two families to come together, because it's not just two people, it's two families that are coming together. And in such situations, they say love, intimacy is the goal they're aspiring to. It's not the place it starts. And see, for us as Americans, we say it is that intimacy and love that starts it. And then you hope it continues on. Within these other communities, no, I don't even know this person. Sometimes, literally, they would not see their spouse until the wedding day. But here was the expectation that we can get to know each other. We've got a lifetime to learn to appreciate each other, to fall in love with each other. And sometimes that doesn't happen. But similarly, sometimes in our system, you think you've got your soulmate and it turns out you're wrong. Something else comes up. So there are a lot of different ways of doing this. And there's a lot of different expressions of this thing called love and relationship and learning to get along with another human being. Biblically, there's this really fascinating notion that the two can become one. I think about the person I am today as opposed to the person who married my wife 42 and a half years ago. I think about the person I've become because of this relationship I have with a single person. And it's not just that person. my wife, but 3 children that come into this as well. Okay, that have pushed me in ways that I couldn't imagine. They have allowed me to become something that I wasn't before. They have forced me to become. And now I have grown children, and I have grandchildren. One of my daughters, the middle daughter, she had a son with her husband, and they've divorced. That man, my son-in-law, I will still call him that. He is an integral part of our family. Not only my wife and I, but also even his ex-wife, my daughter. And we are all part of this great big family. Now, this same daughter, in her early 30s, she finally understood, as she says it to herself, that she was actually gay. And she married a woman who has 3 children of her own. My family keeps getting bigger and more crazy than I had ever imagined. I didn't sign up for this. And I thank God that it has become something that I was not aware of, but just what I needed it to be. We are all in the process, right? God had something in mind when he made us, oh, so long ago. And for some of us, part of that becoming is in an in-depth relationship, a spouse, another half, a fulfillment of the kind of being that we couldn't be without it. For some of us, that includes children and grandchildren, maybe even great-grandchildren. We have to recognize it's going to look something much different than we imagined. When I give you an overview of how other cultures are imagining this, I hope it puts in your head, there's a lot of different ways of doing this. And then when you're going through it yourself, you need to recognize, wow, there's a lot of different ways of doing this. And I wasn't anticipating it. But to accept it for what it is, an opportunity for you to be that neighbor, for you to be that person that God had in mind when he created you. An opportunity for you to be a little Christ for those around you, to love them, to assist them in the stuff that they're doing, and to recognize that this is a supreme privilege. And you get to assist along the way, and you will be assisted on that way as well. Yes, that's all the notes I have. So I can say that's it for my introduction. Now we'll pass it on to somebody who knows what they're talking about. I do see one other bit here. My son married a woman who is Asian. She is Indian Asian, Indian American. So their kids now are half white, half Asian, if we want to use those categories. And for my son, it's learning this other way of being. His wife and family, they're from India, and they've got their own ways of doing things, and he's participating in that. That's unusual, but it is a reality. A mixed marriage. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side was also a mixed marriage. That it wasn't Asian, Indian, and white or American, it was Catholic and Protestant. It was a German Lutheran and an Irish Catholic. And at the time, it was considered a mixed marriage, and both of them were ostracized by their families because they married outside their group. They thought that was worthwhile. They stuck to it on their own, and they did it without the aid of that generation above. This idea of mixed marriage is not fixed. The idea of a typical marriage is not fixed. It's ever developing and flowing. It is very important for us to recognize there's lots of ways of doing this. So give yourself some of that permission and recognize that here's a relationship. I enjoy this person. I can't imagine living without them. I'm going to go for it in spite of what others say. And to embrace that. You know, we're each on our own way. Each becoming, and enjoy it on the way. So here's the experts.
Oh, there she goes. So I am Jen Hargis, as many of you already know, and I lived in Kazakhstan for 4 years. I graduated from Concordia, Nebraska, And then I went overseas for 4 years. And then I lived in Mongolia for a year too. But in Kazakhstan, I had a different experience. So my second year of living there, there was a family that I became close to. They were from the Russian Lutheran Church, and they had 7 kids. 2 of them were older than me. 2 guys were older than me. They had 2 sons older than me, and then a bunch of younger sons. They had a daughter who was similar to my age. So her and I became really close. And we would go to their house. I would go to their house on the weekends, spend the night, hang out. They would teach me how to cook like Russian food. And then we would go to church on Sunday. It was good language learning because the 2 of the kids knew English pretty well. Well, not really well, like enough that between my broken Russian and their broken English, we could communicate. And so during my second year there, one of these Saturday evenings when we were there, we were sitting around the kitchen table and drinking tea. And all of a sudden there was like a flurry of just commotion. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. They actually switched the language to Kazakh, which I don't understand. I didn't understand any of it, hardly, at that time. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. So it was myself, another volunteer that I worked with, and then the mom of this family, and my friend, who I'm going to call her Rima, just for security purposes. And so we were just sitting there drinking tea, and then all of a sudden there was this commotion, and it was like a U. So we were in the kitchen and we were around the table, but I was stuck, so I couldn't get out of it. Like I couldn't escape the room at all. And all of a sudden my friend starts throwing candy at me. And then she takes a scarf off of the wall and she gives it to her mom, and her mom ties it on my head. And I was like, oh, no. Like, and in my mind, I knew what was happening is, I forget the Kazakh term that they were doing, but it's like, they were saying, you're in our family now. I want you, so then the mom kissed my cheeks and said, you're my daughter in Russian. And I said, no. I looked at my friend and I said, I can't do this. I said, I'm American. My dad would be so mad if I did this. I basically blamed it all on my family. And then, like, as the night went on, so I'm getting ahead of myself. So as we're sitting there talking, I said, I can't do this. My dad, our cultures are different. First of all, the young man, he wasn't even there. I don't even know if he knew this was happening at the time, but I knew he wouldn't have been opposed to it because, there was many comments throughout our 1.5 years of knowing each other that he wanted to go on a date and stuff with me, but I wasn't there to date him. And so as the night went on, I was very nervous because I didn't know what was going on, because they're talking in their language. And so as we were getting ready to go to bed, and my friend and we had to go out to the outhouse because they didn't have indoor plumbing. And I said, Rima, I can't marry your brother. I said, we don't speak the same language. How are we going to communicate? I said, I'm living in Kazakhstan, but I don't know how long I'm going to live here. Like, it's just not possible. I said, I said, I love your brother as a brother in Christ, but I don't love him as my future husband. And I didn't go back to their house for a long time. And like, I would see them in church and it was just always awkward. I eventually became like, with my friend Rima and we, mended our relationship, but it really hurt our relationship in the fact that she thought I was going to, I didn't want to be part of their family, but it wasn't that. But in my, I love their family. Like, they were like my family when I was living there. They kind of adopted me. But it was just the whole cultural thing. So bride napping isn't a huge thing in that part of Kazakhstan, but we did know a couple young girls who were bride napped, but they were more bride napped because they didn't have money, or the man didn't have money to pay for the girl, to pay the family. Like, is it the dowry? Yeah, the dowry. So it was kind of an arranged bride napping in that situation. But I know the volunteers that I worked with, the Baker family, I don't know if I just said that, but they know people who were bride napped. And it was, some of them turned out to be really good and some of them turned out to be not a happy situation. So that's my story.
It kind of reminds me of a couple years ago where Dr. Mallinson actually was up here at Global, and he said, hey, can you come talk about gender kind of from a cross-cultural perspective, right? Thinking about gender relationships. And then I kind of spun the talk to be more about us right here in America. And I guess I'm going to do the same thing to you, which is, kind of examining how do we see love in an American context? Because I do kind of think that we have these very set perspectives of what is natural to us, what feels natural. Clearly, when you're traveling and you're encountering different intercultural practices, then you're confronted with a different set of natural. And some of those things can be unsettling, complicated, frustrating, lost in translation. And as Dr. Schultz said, how many phrases do we have about there's one fish in the sea, many fish in the sea, I don't know, whatever, right? You're going to find your fish, which is terrible. I don't like fish, so it sounds awful, right? But how much do we actually have a sophisticated conversation about what it means to fall in love? What does that look like? What does falling out of love, quote unquote, look like? And I think in many ways, I see the American conceptualization of love being pretty juvenile. And I'm not saying that as an indictment. I myself fell into that, right? So here I am sitting next to a gentleman who I didn't choose, and he would not have been, uh-oh, here we go. I gotta quick get this in before his mic.
There was no bride nap.
Right, okay, this is true.
And I guess she didn't find Nemo either.
Right, no, I didn't. But I myself, as a young woman, had very strong conceptualizations of, finding the right person and a match made in heaven or whatever the kind of popular culture tells us. And I was in a very serious relationship, actually, when I met my husband, who's Paul over here, of somebody who was a great fit all the categories.
Great guy.
Was Christian. I'm a pastor's daughter. He was a pastor's son. I was a sociology major. He was a political science major. I wanted to go into business. Don't ask. That's another talk. He was going to go into law. And so in many ways, it was, a match made in heaven. Our families got along well. And it was very comfortable. And for me, already in high school, people were asking about my wedding. What is that going to be like? And I was kind of marching down the very strong cultural categories of what a successful relationship would look like. We had, a strong affinity for one another. I trusted this person. There's no negativity to the story. But then I went to a different culture and I lived there. And on the first day, I was insulted by this gentleman to my right, who mocked me, made fun of me, laughed at me.
I'm going to interject right now.
But all with his cheeky smile.
All of this was true.
Yes.
Before this talk was happening, Koenig tells me, I know what Jack's going to say. It can be scholarly. And I know what I'm going to say.
I haven't got there yet.
No, I know that. She said, what the heck are you going to say? And I wasn't sure, but I now know. And earlier, she told the kids, you know, you guys got to chill out because we're both going to be talking. And the eldest, Oliver, said, what's Dad got to say this way? So I figured he was going to be right, and he might still be. But why I interjected, I've completely forgotten. But it's going to come back to me, and I'm going to jump in at that point.
Anyway, so let me lift up a couple of observations.
Oh, I got it. I'm back. Okay, so it's cultural. Okay, so anybody who's got to know me should know this, and anybody who knows English people should know this. But just in case you don't, if an English guy is nice to you, polite, says all the right things, he probably doesn't like you very much. If he's mean, mocking, derogatory, yeah, he's got the hots. So anybody that knew me knew within the first hour of being Koenig, I was done. Hence, the mockery and the derogatory statements. Okay, I can rest the mic now. Continue.
So meeting somebody who challenged my own categories of what I thought was natural and how men and women should interact, and was challenged, and it was very uncomfortable. And yet, 7 years later, I finally admitted that maybe we should be dating.
Just for the record, I'd started dating her 2 years later, but I didn't find out till more recently she didn't start dating me till 7 years later. And that might sound a really complicated situation, but you know, that's maybe another story for another time, or maybe later, I don't know, we'll see how it goes.
And in that journey, what I found out is, you know, humans are complex, but they're more complex in relationship with other people. So the messiness is in that intimacy and in the relationships, and in the willingness to trust one another, to push one another, to challenge each other. And that when you get into more complicated relationships where the person doesn't, right? Even though we're not fully cross-cultural, we're both Anglo-Saxon, speak the same language-ish. I know I speak American.
You speak American, I speak English, let's not mix that up.
There are things lost in translation, and there definitely were when we first were dating, and especially in terms of how the dynamics of the family, how we interacted with, how I interacted with Paul's family and how Paul interacted with my family. It definitely felt kind of foreign and uncomfortable. And yet, a lot of growth took place there. And for me as a young woman, I think a lot of the things I wasn't realizing is there's social science research, even though I was a sociologist, that could be looked at. Talking about the nature of a strong relationship is about trust and interdependence. It's about yes, attraction, but I just was reading a great article that was saying that really romance is just kind of paying it forward for commitments and intimacy in the long term. And so that you kind of have to think of it as romance is the startup cost, is how they termed it. And I really thought that's a great way of seeing this. In the first relationship I had, there's probably more, he knows what I'm going to say, maybe sexual attraction to my first boyfriend. Wait, this isn't going to end well.
So I need to clarify, there was more sexual attraction to him than me, or there's just more sexual attraction? Was there any sexual attraction with me?
Nevertheless, we should have practiced.
No.
What I discovered is something incredibly important, which is God really did work his way into this relationship, just like he could have any relationship, but through friendship. And so one of the most important things I sort of discovered as a young woman is, you know, my cultural conceptualizations of what a marriage looks like or what a partner is going to look like were very, very restricted, and not realizing that sometimes walking out of those very strong categories takes risk and is not always comfortable, especially when you're interacting with family members or different culture. Definitely where we had probably the most tension is Paul was, agnostic or a non-believer, and my mom told him, if you're going to come visit, we have one rule, which is you go to church with us if you want to eat my pot roast, right? So like that was, she laid it on the line, and she just said that's the expectation, and he was.
I got pot roast.
Yes, respectful. But it helped me understand when I look at my own children, right? When I look at my own mentees and residents is sometimes to push ourselves not to fall into these really strong cultural categories of, what is love, and falling out of love is difficult, but it also is what are human relationships, and recognizing that maybe these human relationships that are coming to you are a gift. One of my best friends never got married, and that's a difficult thing in our culture. And she once said to me, nobody talks about what if you're just single as a woman, and that if you don't find that person, right? So pushing our culture also to talk about the complexities of humans who maybe they're widowed, or maybe they're divorced early, or maybe they have multiple marriages, right? We have kind of serial monogamy. In sociology, we call this kaleidoscope families. And that's actually more the reality for most families than the nuclear family. And yet, those are the families that reflect our culture and our time. They're still the places that we socialize in, that we build trust and love, hopefully. Not all of our families are always healthy, but that it's, it takes commitment too, right? So one of my sort of comments to you is when you're starting to think about dating is think about this person, do you want to change their diapers? What if they don't remember your name? And that's not to be cynical or depressing, but if you really want to be committed to this person, is not thinking about, the ring by spring or the ritual of the wedding. Those are important markers in our culture, but it's kind of thinking past that. What happens when you lose jobs or lose children, or when you lose parents, when you have your brothers who go through divorces? These are things, right, that have happened to us. And to have somebody who you can, ugly cry with, which yes, Paul's seen lots of that in my life.
Although she's never ugly when she's like that. It's really cute. I know, but it's true.
Is probably one of the biggest gifts that I've ever been given is the humility of finding love and intimacy in places that really I wasn't kind of looking for. I was looking for it in a much more kind of prescribed sense of this guy fits the bill, right? And I'm sure we could have made it work, but this guy, I would argue, fits the bill nicely.
But apparently no sexual attraction.
I mean, at least 3 times, but. So I just want to counsel you, right, as you go forward, to kind of think about, your relationships in these, what seems natural is probably culturally constructed, what your perceptions of the ideal are probably culturally constrained, and that relationships are messy, and that you are intimate with somebody who's also part of a family and part of a culture, part of a time period where you've got to work through all that, and you have to be patient through all that, and it's not perfect. And we don't talk enough about, how many relationships don't last and why they don't last and the stressors on that. And I think as a culture, we should kind of shore up young people a little bit better in talking about, all right, if you're going to get married, go through premarital counseling, or have your families definitely meet each other. Talk about, I can give you some studies that say, here's the 17 to 20 questions that you should ask. And most of them are pretty mundane questions about your livelihoods, your ambitions, your amount of kids. Are you going to stay friends with your friends? Are you going to be willing to move or sacrifice for this person? Are you going to be able to give up your job if need be? And those are not fun questions to ask. But again, the research shows those are the questions that are important for us to think about in terms of our relationships, in terms of finding love, because those are the things that, again, end up following us into our later life cycles.
That's pretty heavy.
Yeah, sorry.
Don't you remember your dad asking us if we wanted to do premarital counseling with him?
Oh yeah, that's just awkward.
Yeah, we didn't do that. And I think she's right. All those questions like matter, and maybe getting hold of those questions and thinking about it with whoever you're thinking of being with is important. I don't know if necessarily, sorry, I don't know if you necessarily need to go through counseling or anything, but maybe it's helpful to have a third party or a group of friends you can work through it with. The best advice I can give to you, certainly because it's worked for me, is find somebody who's your best friend, and then maybe ask them to marry you at some point. And I don't say that flippantly either, in the sense of, like, we're just best friends. Like, she's my buddy from college. Yes, I was sexually attracted to her. But she was my buddy from college, and I enjoyed being with her. And, you know, like, if it was hanging out with the guys or hanging out with Koenig, I hung out with Koenig. And that wasn't just at college. That's 5 years ago or 5 weeks ago. I still would rather hang out with her than anybody else, including my kids, sorry. And the way you set it up with this idea of, like, it just seemed really heavy about all these decisions you have to make about finding the right person. And I kind of fell into it, right? Here's my buddy. I met her through the grace of God and some strange accidents. We hung out. We kept hanging out. All the other suitors kind of dropped off. And then I asked her to marry me. And maybe I should have done it years before, but the reality is we were best friends. And, you know, I guess we coupled up, right? And the reason I'm saying this is because I kind of was always best friends with the cute girls. I was always in the friend zone, but I never had girlfriends. And it's because I never asked. And they never asked me. And the reason I'm married is because I made another best friend, and that relationship went on forever and probably would have continued, but it would never have gone on to anything until I actually grew a pair and asked. And I'm only saying that because I know how easy, like our friend, I know how easy it is to go through life scared of being rejected. And a friendship, the friendship with you, like, it's 98% of our relationship. The other fun stuff, you know, it's 2%. Maybe it was more years ago, but it's 2%. Like, the friendship's real, right? And so if you've got a real good friend, the person you turn to, who helps you get through the relationships that break down and don't work out, the person you turn to when you're lonely and you want to watch a movie, the person you turn to grab a coffee, grab a car, even if you ain't getting that tingling feeling, that might be the person. And at some point, one of you has to say, hey, is there more than just friendship here? And risk, like, blowing it. But there's only been two times I've ever really been, you know, took a risk in my life, and they both related to her. And, you know, and we got married as a result, right? So I do think friendship is what it's about. And I think you can answer all those questions, but I think they almost don't need to be asked when you're with a friend. And so find a friend who you're vaguely attracted to, ask them to marry you, be prepared to be engaged for several years.
I'm going to punt it back to Dr. Schultz because he's really the expert here.
Closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts?
Yeah. 2 minutes.
No pressure.
Now I'm on? Okay. I just reiterate what Paul said, friendship. I think that's what it is. When I started dating my wife, we talked. We would sit out on a curb for hours and talk about who we were, what we imagined ourselves to be, what a future would be, a shared future, and getting to know her as a person first. Sex is a lot of fun. but it's not a thing you build a relationship on. It's something that comes out of a relationship. There's a specific place where it's designed to be, and that's in a marriage. You want to build a relationship, it requires that friendship, that communication, that commitment, and getting to know a person as a person, and then see where it goes from there.
So if you got any questions for our esteemed panel, Dr. Mallinson is walking around with a microphone, so please ask.
Okay. Okay. So I was reading something in my textbook for creative nonfiction, and it was talking about this modern idea of like a sort of disparate self versus like a more pre-enlightenment idea of a unified self. There is something in me that makes me me outside of all of the things that I like, my ambitions, my personality, etc. And I'm wondering how your concept of self ties into the sort of viability of a cross-cultural marriage. Like, if you find someone who that thing that is them, that is not the things about them, if that's what helps you connect, or if you have this more disparate sense of self, like your self is developed by your culture, by the people who you talk to, by the things you experienced as a child and what you went through in college, etc. If that makes it almost more difficult, or even just how much that matters. Because you mentioned at the beginning about how love is like one of the strongest emotions, and a couple weeks ago, Dr. BDB did a taco talk on how love is not an emotion, but a choice in the actions that we make, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in regard to that last question, I don't know if I said emotion, but we don't find this word in all societies and all languages. I think I would agree firmly that love is a choice more than it is an emotion. And I would say that even as Dr. Koenig was speaking about that initial passion, infatuation, I think the image that would work in my head is like a match. It lights fast and furious, but it has to then be lit to something else because it's going to blow out, it's going to burn out. So here's the thing that starts the relationship, and then what is it getting fueled by? And eventually, you know, that burns and turns into nice warm coals and all of that. What keeps that going is a series of choices. And every day you wake up and choose to love a person. Whether or not the emotions come with that can be an advantage, a disadvantage, it can be a fun thing, but the reality is it's choice. It is a constant choice. More than anything else, love is a choice. I think that as Christian people, we recognize that. When Jesus gives us the command to love, he's not speaking about follow your passions. He's saying make this choice to do these loving things. And that is something we do even if we don't feel it. Right? And that is something we can do. In regard to the person and say the essence of a person and whether or not it's extremely multifaceted and disparate, it's really hard to speak in general terms about something like a relationship between two people. We are vastly different from each other. So each person is going to require our own ways of expressing this, and the feedback that we're going to get is going to be so dependent upon the person themselves. I think that we do best if we imagine we are in relationship with a person rather than with a male or a female or a Democrat or a Christian or a Lutheran. But here's a person utterly unique. And whatever it is that's required to make this thing happen and whatever it is that I get as a result of that relationship is all that blessing, all that work, all that stuff of life.
What would you guys say is one of the most unexpected things you guys have learned about love and relationships throughout your relationships?
I think I realized I was risk adverse, which meant I wanted to control that I was going to pick the right person and at the right time. And it was actually my brother, who's 10 years older than me, and he looked at me and he said, what are you waiting for? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I don't understand why you're not marrying Paul. I'm like, oh, well, maybe it's not the right time. And he said, there is no right time. You need to make a choice. And I was like, okay. And I didn't realize that I was waiting for this kind of perfect time, all the stars to line up or whatever. Same when we decided to have kids. There's not a good time, right? It's not convenient, it's scary. And that was, I thought I was a little bit more robust, and that is that kind of beauty of figuring out that I'm not self-sufficient all the time. I need this partner to help me make some of these big leaps, and it was scary. Our firstborn was 4 weeks early, and that was one of those like terrifying moments. And it was unexpected to me because I thought I had it all together. I'm like, oh no, I don't have this, right? And I'm very happy that I can share my panic and fear with another human. But yeah, realizing I was risk averse, and then I did have to make some choices, and that it's not all going to be all lights on green. Instead, you have to choose: single, married, parent, right? Like some of these things are not chosen, but in our case, that was kind of the most unexpected thing for me.
My most unexpected thing was she said yes. The second most unexpected thing was that I asked her. And I joke about that, but I'd gone to stay with her family over Christmas of 2002. And I got there 19th of December, and I did not know I was going to ask her to marry me. Hadn't thought about it that trip, hadn't thought about it that year. Hadn't thought about it. Just my buddy. We hung out, we kissed. Nothing else. Held hands. And what happened was, and they don't know this, I don't think, but her cousin called up Christmas Day and said, we're getting married. And I'd met Matt and Jen a couple of years earlier. And like everybody was, and so the announcement goes out and everybody's happy. Like nobody freaked out that Matt had asked Jen to marry her, which was a huge shock for me, because I don't know what I had in my head that, like asking someone to marry you, like the world ends unless they say yeah, right? So literally like that night, I kind of went to bed and went, wow, just like that, he just asked. And they get married and everybody's happy? It can't be that easy. It's as easy and as scary as it was. And it's probably the same as when you're asking somebody out, but I literally asked her dad the next day, hey, we're going down this mountain, curvy roads. I wait till there's a straight bit, because I don't like. And I said, how would you feel about Chris and I getting married? And he kind of stopped and went, yeah, I think that'd be a good idea. Shock again. I'm like, what the heck? Why didn't you tell me, like, playing your cards close to your chest? And he said, is she going to say yes? And I said, I have no idea. We've not talked about it, because we hadn't. And then he said, you should ask Ruth, Kristen's mom. And I did. And again, shock. She said yes also. So there was that rapid shock. Like, I had no idea I was going to ask. I couldn't have planned it because I would have bottled it and given up. And, it came time. I asked her. She said yes, after saying no 7 times in the preceding 10 seconds. And so to answer your question, that was one of the most unexpected things. This person who I loved and adored, who was my best friend, who knew me better than anybody else, and maybe I knew her better than anybody else, but even up to the point of asking, I had no idea whether she would say yes. No clues, no tells. And she did. It was awesome. Great decision, by the way.
Two things that come to my mind, intimacy and commitment. I think that we are enculturated to imagine that you get married and then live happily ever after. And the reality is marriage is just the beginning. And if you think that you've made that commitment, you're wrong. And if you think that intimacy somehow stops, you're wrong. Intimacy and commitment are tied together. So the fact that my wife is committed to me, I can risk saying things about myself that's even hard to admit to myself. And that's what brings about that intimacy, right? I'm sharing these deepest, darkest secrets that I have trouble admitting, and here's another person that still accepts me. And there is that. And so that's scary, it's ongoing, and these commitments are not something you made once and for all, but something that is being done virtually every day. And that was a surprise, but that's where the growth happens too.
One more. He asked somebody to marry him. You could just ask them a question. That's
Scary.
although you didn't have a bunch of like smarty pants watching. There we go. There we go.
So what is one of the scariest things what is one of the hardest things that you encountered while being married?
I think it's like very in line with what Dr. Schultz said, is there is like, again, it's complicated, right? You're in this ongoing relationship and you're in you go through different stages of life. So I would say our 30s were pretty fun. We had lots of weddings that we went to and friends are having babies, and then you get to this stage of life and now it's like people are dying, right? And you're going, like, we know more people who die, and that's pretty depressing, or get divorced, or, you know, suffer tragedy. And thank God I'm not dealing with that all by myself, right? But you go through these different stages, and it's keeping these lines of communication open that you choose every day not to shut down, right? Because I think sometimes you might be exhausted or tired, and if you just are like, I don't really feel like talking about it, well, here's this other person who's like, what's going on? And you might be like, really, are we doing this right now? Okay, yes, we are. And so it's the kind of recommittal to stay in those lines of intimacy, even when you're fatigued and even when you're going through, you know, darker seasons of life where maybe you don't feel like talking about it, and yet, you know, it's important to do so because the other person can observe things. They can know you better than you might pick up on your own. So I suppose that would be how I would think about it.
So for me, the scariest thing is that when it's just you, right? And you can be fearless, throw yourself out of a plane, haven't done that, and die because it doesn't impact anybody else. It doesn't impact, it's just your own decisions. Those decisions are easier than asking someone to marry you, by the way. But for me, the hardest thing is that before we were married and once we were seeing each other, I became vulnerable. You become vulnerable. There's this other person who you care about more than yourself. And then what happens if anything happens to them? And what happens if anything happens to them, that somebody that they care about, right? So it is hard to care about somebody so much and see them in pain, and to be able to do nothing more than hold them and have the ugly tears come out and know that you can't take it away. But there's also something beautiful that I get to do that. But the scariest thing is that now that I have her, I'm scared if anything will ever happen to her. It's out of my control. And I don't necessarily like that feeling, but it kind of comes with it. The moment you stop just being you and you become us, and then you have kids, that's the scary thing, that now there's so much out of my control. But it's a worthy payoff. I wouldn't change it for anything. Jacob, I thought you was going to use the opportunity to maybe ask a question of somebody else and save that for another time.
If you ask me, that was pretty heavy. That was pretty good. That's a pretty good place to stop.
Well, I'm English and I don't do emotions, so that was hard for me. I kept it together.
So anyways, I'd like to, what, it's on. So Thank you, Dr. Mallinson.
I like impersonating you on the recording later. It's fun,
Okay.
actually.
Yeah, just get a more obnoxious voice. Talking about, things that you don't want to admit about yourself, I hate the sound of my voice, but I think we all do. I'm talking about my voice, not your voice. So anyways, hey, I wanted to say thank you to all our speakers, to Dr. Schultz, Dr. Koenig, Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Kargas. One last plug. There's a Cui Bono next Tuesday, correct?
On Tuesday.
Dr. Dave Schultz.
Dr. Schultz will be doing something on objects lesson. And you'll have to come find out what he means by that, because the grammar is incorrect.
And if I was Dr. Armstrong, I'd somehow tie that into pizza, but eat the pizza. Like there's some pizza there. Please take it before you go. Thank you very much. Can you please give everybody a round of applause?
I also just wanted to give a shout out to CUI Green Club, who have now put out the recycling cans in the quads.
We also have one, maybe two openings that just happened in the Global Village on Saturday at 8:30. We're leaving for whale watching. We're trying to see some things. So come over and see Stacy or I. We may have two, but we definitely, I think, have one spot available for this Saturday.
Always, yep. Thank you, man. Good job, good job.
I know, I like